So, hi everyone. As we mentioned, my name is Hiro. I'm really excited about this course because I think growing up, I would have loved to have learned this for my service. It comes with a lot of practical information for us as youth ministers, and that's the goal. The goal of all of this is that you can serve better. Right? I'm not sure. I remember asking this question last year. Why did you guys join this class? Can you guys just give me a reason? And an honest reason. Guys, yeah. So that was the exact answer I had last year. Everyone's like, yeah, we don't really hold me to join this class. So there's a purpose behind everything, and I truly do believe that. And Abuna, in his wisdom, he wants us to be better at our service, right? And this course will do that, and the program as a whole will do that. It will allow you to be able to serve better, reach out to the youth better, and that's what we want. Okay. I'm going to speak a little louder. So, to give you guys a little bit of background on myself, I'm not from Mississauga originally. I grew up in Vaughan. I went to a church in Etobicoke, very small church. And then afterwards, in university, I moved to Ottawa for a year, there, and then I came back here. I started studying with the Mississauga church. I might have seen either at the core church or at the church of K2. What I've noticed is when we talk about culture, it can mean a lot of things to us. And even based on where we're from, that can make a difference. Are most of you from Mississauga? Did any of you grow up in Mississauga? Yes. Okay. Somewhere. So when you went to elementary school or high school, did you have fellow Coptic Christians? Yeah. You had probably at least a handful, right? So for a lot of other people, that's not the option, or that's not the case. It's you are the only Coptic Christian, you're the only Christian only Orthodox Christian, and you might feel a little bit of an outcast, or your culture might be a little bit different from the culture that you're seeing in high school. So this I always say is a blessing. Those who were fortunate to grow up in Mississauga, that we can almost say you've been able to create this own little bubble of a culture so that we can keep you in our church a little bit better. As I said, that's not always the case in a lot of places because you are constantly bombarded by outside culture. So my goal today, and I know you guys just got the books, but I'm going to review a little bit of the material from the book, and then we're going to go into a little bit of a case study. Right? So, as I said, the purpose of the class to appreciate the current culture of today's youth in relation to Christian culture, identify strategies and effective mission to the young people. Right? So if we can't do this, then this whole class is worthless. Right? So that's what we want. Another thing about me, I hate public speaking, so I really ask you guys when I ask questions, please participate. I hate it when I ask questions when I'm just kind of standing here. So it makes me less nervous, and I appreciate that. So the topics that we're going to be talking about today is understanding the culture, examining Christian culture. We're going to discuss modernism, postmodernism, and we're going to hopefully get to, and I'm not sure if we'll have enough time, but discuss secularism and how to apply this to the youth mission. Right? So, as I said, we're all here because we want to further improve our service, or because Abuna told us that we want to improve our service. We want to be better equipped to handle today's current issues. And this I always like to say, when Jesus came to save us, he didn't come on this giant chariot to go and save everyone and say, I am king, right? He approached us on our own level. And I think we kind of underestimated just how much of a difference that made to people. When Jesus went to, the sinners, it wasn't, I am better than you. And that is what it is. He came as one of us, as a fellow human, and he came to serve us. And even when he would discuss things with the Pharisees or with the Sadducees, what would he do? He would quote scripture for them because that was their language. So he was speaking in their own language or in their own cultural language. And then when he goes to someone else, you see, he starts speaking in their own language. We could see it with the kids when he was talking to the little children. It's not like he's still quoting Bible or scripture. He's playing with the children, saying, "Let the little children come to me." Right? He didn't need to use quotes for them because that wasn't their culture. That's not what they can understand. And so part of our service has to be just like that. We have to understand the people that are in front of us and how we can respond to them and how we can connect to them. So we need to have the same mind.
He talks to you with these abilities that he makes you feel believable and
Okay, I like that. So that was one way that he connected you. He was very, we'll say, open with you, right? How about anyone else? Yes. Empathetic. Okay, very good. So, and just like what you were both saying, when you would come up to him and ask him a question, it's not just that I'm your servant, right? It's your one-on-one time. What else? What else made the servant so special? Yes.
Their approachability and their willingness to spend time with outside of Sunday school, like going out, just hanging out at his house or whatever it might be.
And that could
Being seeing him as a person, as opposed to, like, say, that servant.
And that's good because it's the outside of church as well. I think sometimes we have a very bad habit of we almost separate our church life from the rest of our lives. So when we see servants that are still servants outside of church, it almost gives you a new perspective. It's like, huh, okay. Any other special qualities? That's great. So now I have another question for you all. Do you remember any of the lessons that these servants taught you? You remember any like specific class or something like that?
I remember one of the students one time, he created like a meditation concept where he brought a candle and he like does it on a prayer, which sounds like I guess like we should take all of us and just make sure God said anything about it was and like
That's awesome. I love that. And the big thing with these servants is you kind of mentioned it there. It's how did you feel at that time, right? It's you were feeling like you were getting closer to God through the servants. You might not always remember their lessons realistically, but you always remember how they made you feel, right? That was part of that connection. So they were able to speak to you on a one-on-one where they were getting down to your cultural norms and connecting with you on that level, and then they were able to bring you towards Christ. And so that's great. So this is what we're going to be talking about a big chunk of our class today. You can actually find it in your youth culture textbook. But this is kind of our representation of culture. So at the very base of it, there's the worldview. Then we go to beliefs, then values, behaviors, and symbols. All right. So we're going to get to each one, and this book talks about the culture from this perspective. So the symbols, all right, that's the very outer layer. It's basically what is valuable to you. All right. So it's the easiest thing to really alter. So when you think about it, do any of you wear crosses at moments? Very good. That's fine if you don't. Now, let's think of a rapper. Do rappers wear crosses? Most likely they do, right? These things, these are basically, they come from that world, from that core, but they become an outward symbol, but they're at the very outside, if you know. So when we talk about symbols or that outer layer, it's, we might value it, but it's not necessarily a representation of our worldview, right? It just might be something that's been affected by our worldview. So if this rapper, for example, was born in a Judeo-Christian environment, or he was Christian, raised Christian, and sees the big cross, he liked it, and so he kept it going, right? It might not mean that they are necessarily a practicing Christian, right? But that's part of that symbols that they have, right? Even if we can take that cross out, let's think of other religions or faiths. Do they have special symbols? What would they be? What would other symbols be for other faiths? You want to think of anything? I'll give you an example. In Islam, what do they have? The crescent or the shahada, as they call it. So you might see it like at the very like at their doorpost, just like how we put a cross at our doorpost, right? They might have the shahada right up top. Are they practicing Muslim? They might not. Just like there are some practicing Christians that might have a cross, but that might not mean that they are necessarily Christian, right? So these symbols, they're the outward representation of our culture, right? It's just because they've been so ingrained. So when we think of North America, we say, in God we trust. We have a lot of crosses, a lot of Judeo-Christian background in a lot of the things that we do. And so that's why maybe it's normal to hear, to see a cross in a school, for example, right? But if you go to somewhere that is not a Judeo-Christian base, so we're talking about, say, China, would they necessarily have crosses in their schools? Probably not, right? Because they weren't raised with that in their culture. So again, symbols, that's the outer layer, right? So if I were to try to connect someone with the symbols, would that work? Or would it be a deep, meaningful relation? Probably not. When we talk about symbols, let's talk about things that happen in the Bible. When we think about the Bible, there's actually a very good example of these symbols being forcefully changed on a group of people. So, does anyone remember Daniel Lionston, right? What were his three friends? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? What did the king try to do with them? Can you remember what the king was trying to do or force upon them? Specific ways of living, but he was basically trying to affect that symbolism, right? So if I can change the way they eat, maybe I'll change the way they are. If I change their names, if I change their language, maybe then I will change who they are and bring them to my faith. That is what the king was thinking, right? But we know what happened. They might have changed the names, the outward symbols of who they were, but that didn't affect their culture. That didn't affect their worldview. That stayed the same. They were still praising God. And that's kind of an example of a failed change where the king tried to change someone, but he wasn't able to, right? Then we go to the next part, the behaviors. So behaviors are what's acceptable, right? So this is still on the outer edge. So you see there's actually 4 layers before we get to that worldview. So symbols and behaviors, they're still on that outer layer. Because of this, it's still defining our culture, but it's not a very deep-rooted, meaningful thing. So each culture might have different behaviors based on what their worldview is. So in the past, for example, we believe that what abortion was just an absolute wrong, right? It was not acceptable. In the past, we were more, we'll say, ingrained with our worldview of, again, the Judeo-Christian culture. Now the Judeo-Christian culture or the worldview has eroded a little. So now it brings weight to, well, it depends. Abortion's now not a absolute no, it's a questionable thing. Maybe it might be okay in certain situations, maybe it's not, right? That's how we see our worldview has actually changed from 50 years ago, from 100 years ago. When we see the behaviors, what is acceptable has changed, that's when you know the actual worldview has changed. So as it wears away, the behavior begins to change, and that includes what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. In a Jewish community or a Muslim community, they might not be eating pork. That's a simple behavioral change, right? So if you go to Egypt, it is very hard to find pork. You know, I'm sure you can find it in certain areas, but overall, it's very hard to find it because all the Muslims there that they do not eat pork, right? Because again, why? It's part of their culture. It's part of that deep-rooted cultural worldview that they have. So now we talked about symbols and behaviors. Now we're going to get to a little bit of the deeper layers. The first one is values. So values is what is important, right? So this is where we now go into that traditional part of culture from the outwards to the inwards. So we have many youth now that love going out and having fun, right? That's normal. But the problem is now it's more important than coming to church. Now this is a value that's now changing. So what is important to me is now becoming different. When I was maybe 100 years ago, they believed, you know, church is the most important thing and nothing else beats it. I will go to church Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Friday there's youth group meetings, Sunday or Saturday there's tasbih, Sunday there's liturgy, right? That was the norm. Now it's, well, Friday, my friends have something else going on. I want to go out with them, right? So their values have changed to an extent where church is not the most important thing. Christ is not the most important thing. And this is, again, this is how we're seeing worldviews change, or what is a person's worldview? We can start to define it from their values. And when you have an understanding of the values, you predict behavior. So for example, if I have someone who tells me, you know, I value drinking alcohol, for example, chances are their behavior is going to go alongside that. So if I know that this person enjoys drinking alcohol, chances are they might be going to a bar on Friday, Saturday nights, have a drink, right? Because that's their values. Values change, obviously, and everything here can be changed. Right? And that's what our goal is, the hope is that we bring people towards the proper worldview, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And when we lead to behavioral changes, we can change symbols as well. So again, values, what is important, that's where we can actually start making changes. And that is long-lasting changes, put it that way. And then we're going to get into beliefs. So now beliefs, that's one of the closest things to our worldview, all right? And it is what is true. Now notice there's a difference between everything else. Before it was what is important, what is acceptable, what is valuable. But our beliefs are what is true and what is not true. This is where we have that transition, because what we believe is right will define everything else, right? If I truly believe that God does not exist, then my values will change, my behaviors will change, my symbols will change. If I believe God exists and truly I believe that, again, my values will change, my behaviors will change, my symbols will change. And this is where we start getting into the hot topics, right? So premarital sex, necessity of formal prayer, views about the church, all that is part of the beliefs. So again, you might have a youth that says, what is actually wrong with premarital sex if I know I'm going to marry that person? You know, what's the big deal? Or they say again, why do I need to have proper formal prayer? I don't believe I need to connect with God by reading that Veda 7 times every day. Why can't I connect with God by just saying a prayer in my own head? Why do I need to go to church? Why do I need the sacraments? That is a part of their beliefs, their actual beliefs, that we need to make sure is aligned with the church. And what's difficult about these beliefs, symbols, remember we said that's easy to change. Behaviors, that can be easy to change. But values and beliefs, that's very hard. Why do you think changing values and beliefs is very hard? Any ideas?
Probably they came from years of experience and read the person.
Yeah.
It's very hard.
So it's been ingrained over time, right? When you want to teach someone something, how do you usually teach if you have a child or just anyone younger? What is that usually teach them? Or how do you teach them? Usually through repetition, right? I know there's the Arabic saying, what is it? Takrir. Yes. So repetition makes perfect, right? This is what happens with a lot of our values and beliefs. It's slowly ingrained into us over years. So for these youth, it's over years. You don't see a youth all of a sudden saying, I want to leave the church. I have never seen a youth say, I hate the church just from growing up, right? What happens is they had a negative experience, and now it's eroded their views of the church. I don't think the church is perfect anymore. And because I don't think the church is perfect anymore, it's now affecting my belief in the church. And now my beliefs begin to change. So one example of this, and this is where the devil really does fight a lot of the youth. He will try to present the church as something that is imperfect. And when he shows youth the church is imperfect, then it makes them question everything else. Unfortunately, our church, it is perfect, but sometimes people within the church might not. I myself am not perfect. None of us are perfect. We know that, right? We only know the only person who is perfect is Christ. The church is valued, or its values, its beliefs are based on Christ's teaching, right? So because of this, we know the church itself, the theology is perfect. But we do know as well, like how we mentioned areas, there are people within the church that might not be perfect. There are people in the church that might corrupt it. What happens is say a youth is still very impressionable, a youth is very new at this, right, at learning the faith, and they see that, oh, I was taught something and I was told afterwards that this actually isn't true. Well, if that isn't true, what else isn't true about the church? This is why I really don't like it when parents will tell their kids, oh, you have to do this or else God is going to be mad at you, right? Like you always hear that. That's the worst thing you can tell the kids, because as they grow up, what happens is, oh, so God isn't loving me 24/7. Well, if he doesn't love me, but you guys just told me that he loves me 24/7, but if I commit the sin, he doesn't love me anymore. Now I've lost a little bit of faith in my God, right? Even when we talk about like homosexuality, we all know homosexuality is wrong. Does that mean we hate the person who is homosexual? No, we've never said that once. But yet, for some reason, the church is vilified. The church is shown as, oh, it hates people. We have never said that. We have never said we hate people. We have never said we hate homosexuals. We hate the sin behind it. And so what happens is a young impressionable youth that does not understand the faith, that has not been theologically trained, that has not been taught all of this, they might see that, oh, the church is hateful. How can I be a part of something that is full of hate? And then they start to say, well, if the church is hateful, what else is wrong with it? What else is wrong? And so their beliefs, they start to find these cracks, and it changes it. It changes their belief system. And so the very core of this, which is what we are talking about, the worldview, that is what we view as what is real, right? So this is the deepest level of culture, and this deals with assumptions about life and the entire culture it adheres to. Ones that deal with the meaning or purpose of life, who or what is God, and what is my value? And these questions basically build an entire culture. Think of laws. Why do we have laws? Right? It's because our worldview, we view certain things as right, certain things as wrong. It's also why we know that some things were punishable by law 50 years ago are no longer punishable by law. Right? Or if we go to different countries, their worldview is different than ours, and so they might consider this illegal versus us, right? So again, the worldviews or what is real, that is that core of the culture, and that defines everything else. So it also dictates what is right and what is wrong, and why do we need to be good if there is nothing outside of this world? If I have no direction, why follow someone versus someone else? If there is no God, then why should I be doing what I'm doing? Or should I only just be doing whatever benefits me only? So now we know the different layers, we'll say, of culture. And again, this is the basis of this entire book, we'll say the youth culture, it's based on this part. All right, so I want to make sure that we're taking a lot of time on this because I want you guys to understand it as best as possible. Let's apply what we've built, or let's now, so now that we've built these layers of our culture, let's apply to a few examples. So symbols may be the same in Christian culture because they likely came from, way back when, right? So does that mean that it is a representation of the culture or a representation of the worldview? If again, my symbol of the cross, does that show me what my worldview is? Yes or no? Simple. Why not? Okay, but my question was, is it a representation of what my worldview might have been? That's what I said. Good answer. The answer is intense, right? You can have one person wearing a cross, another person wearing a cross, completely different worldviews, right? How about when we talk about behaviors? We see one person who is, we'll say, very well behaved. And when I say well behaved, I'm saying they don't swear, they're very pleasant, very nice, right? They don't want to be bullies, they don't want to hurt people, right? What is that a representation of? Would that be a representation of a Judeo-Christian belief system? Again, yes or no? It depends. Very good. Because again, that's a very broad statement where they could be either or. I could be a good person without being a Christian, and vice versa. I could be a Christian without being a good person. Right? How about let's talk about values a little bit. So say this is a good one. This actually has nothing to do with the church. We are all Egyptians, right? For most of it. What are you told that you should be? What kind of educational status should you have growing up? What are the 3 career choices? Doctor, pharmacist, engineer. That is a good example of our values. So what is important to us? What is important to Christian or to Egyptians? Education is the most important thing. And so you have to be one of the most educated people to be successful, because that's what's important, education. Doesn't matter if you're making money or not, it's are you educated, right? So that is a value that we have. Now, coming to Canada, is that the same value? Would you say like Canadians have that same kind of value system? No. What do they value success as? Or what is important to say Canadians? Canadian culture. You do what you like. Exactly. So that being said, let's expand on that a little bit more. We have a lot of immigrants. We have a lot of people who were born here in Canada that are youth right now. What do we find they struggle with a lot? Especially if they have their parents that are immigrants. What happens? Yeah, they get a mix of worldviews. So what's the parental worldview? They have to be a doctor, pharmacist, or engineer. What are they being told from their Canadian culture? Do what makes you happy, right? And so why is there a struggle there? Or why can this actually lead to depressions, can lead to suicidal ideations, can lead to a lot of cracks in the belief system? Why do you think that is?
Because they want to do what they like. At the same time, you have youth that want to prepare us to be successful in the education space.
Absolutely. It's 2 different forces. Now, would you say the parents might feel if they make a decision, is it a right or wrong decision to the parents? If say the person says, I want to be a drama teacher, right? Would the parents view this as, a right decision or a wrong decision? Bad decision, right? They would probably say, you are throwing your life away. You are making the worst decision of your life. Don't do this, right? And the problem with this is what? This person might go be a drama teacher and might end up being very successful. Now what happens?
They lose their faith and their trust in everything that their parents do.
That's perfect. They lose faith and trust in everything their parents tell them. Because my parents told me that the only way I was going to be successful is if I was a doctor, pharmacist, or engineer. I wasn't that. I'm still successful. So they lied to me about that. What else are they lying to me about? I'm going to throw you guys a little bit of a case study about this. There's a youth. They wanted to go to pharmacy school because, again, parents kept telling them, doctor, pharmacist, engineer. And they weren't the smartest kid, but, they had an option or opportunity to go to England because that's where a lot of kids go for pharmacy school. So what ends up happening is the kid is a little scared. I don't know if I can do this on my own. What happens? The dad's like, no, get that. You can do this. You're smart. You can do anything you put your mind to. Lots of encouragement. And he says, but I'm scared about just living on my own. I don't have how am I going to deal with expenses? Well, don't worry, it's easy. You can handle it. You know what to do. You're going to be 20 something now. You can figure it out. Now he's finished pharmacy school, graduated. Everyone's happy. He's supposed to come back to Canada. He found a girlfriend in England. He doesn't want to leave. His dad is now saying, how are you going to manage? You can't, how are you going to be on your own? What's going to happen to this youth when he hears that from his dad? And this is a real person, just so you know. It's contradicting. I was told early on I could do this. Now I'm being told I cannot. 4 years later when I've lived in the country. And I managed to do it, exactly. And now my dad's telling me, no, I can't. What does that tell me? If you were the youth, what does that tell you?
Doesn't trust me.
He doesn't trust me. He doesn't trust me. That's one thing. What else does it tell me?
Doesn't trust my decisions.
Doesn't trust my decisions. Okay, what else?
No freedom.
No freedom. And that's huge. Kids nowadays are being told freedom is what? Freedom to do whatever you want. Freedom to sin. Freedom to expose yourself to any and everything, right? It is not bad to try weed once. I'm trying it out. I'm exploring the world. It is not bad to, go out to this place and that place because I'm learning, I'm becoming cultured, right? So I'm losing my freedom when my parent tells me you have to be back home by this time. I'm losing my freedom when my parent tells me, I need to be back from school after, I finished the program. So what's happening is I am now, it's not just a loss of freedom, it's not just a loss of this, but I had trusted my father who raised me all these 20 some odd years. And now he's telling me something that goes against what I believed in him as. So what's going to happen? There's going to be a fracture in that relationship. You don't trust me, I don't trust what you're saying anymore. And this happens. And it's unfortunate because once that relationship is broken, it's very hard to fix. It's a betrayal almost, right? My father betrayed me by saying this. And parents, they don't always understand this. This is where youth ministry really comes into play. Because unfortunately, parents are emotional with their kids. We are emotional. I'll give you an example today. I was a deacon. I had Mike with me, and I heard my son crying in the back of the church, right? And my smartwatch dings, and I see my wife telling me, he won't stop crying, he wants you, right? What did I do? Husband and me, I gave the mic to someone else, and I went and I got him, right? Because I am emotional. It's not, I need to, sing the tasbih. There's a child, I can hear him from the back crying, I need to soothe him, right? That's how I am as a father. Unfortunately, I am emotional just like every single father, just like every single mother, right? So we see here our values now. Notice how when we talk about the behaviors and symbols, it was very kind of outwards. It wasn't that fractured, relationship fracture. But now we're talking about values. Now we start to see those fractures, right? How about the belief system? So this is where education can become very dangerous when we talk about liberal education, right? When we go into university, we are taught a lot of things is right and wrong. Unfortunately, we're not taught what is the Christian values of right and wrong, or the Christian beliefs. It's the liberal beliefs of what is right and wrong, and that can very much skew the person's view, right? So if I am going to university and they're saying that we must be tolerant of everyone and everything, and no decision is bad, it's what they view themselves. If they view themselves as he and you view them as a she, doesn't matter what you see. Empirically, it doesn't matter what your thoughts are. It's what they believe themselves to be. You have to follow along, right? And if you don't, what are you? You're hateful. You're bigots. Whatever you want to be called, right? So every time I come to school, every time I go to work, every time I go to wherever environment, I'm being told if I don't believe this, I am hateful, I am a bigot, I am racist, I am sexist, I am whatever, right? That's gonna wear away on me. Little by little, it's gonna keep wearing away at me until what happens? My belief will be, I have to, be tolerant, as we say. The only way I'm tolerant is if I agree with them. So my belief system now has to change. That's what the culture is telling us. My belief of what is right and wrong has to change if I am going to continue in this way. Does that make sense, guys?
No, I don't disagree.
Okay.
No, because tolerance is different from agreeing.
Yes.
So I don't like a certain behavior in a certain person. I tolerate it, doesn't mean I believe it.
Absolutely. I agree with you, and that's what you're supposed to do. What I'm saying is, unfortunately, the world is trying to change that to if you're not tolerating by agreeing, then you are hateful. That's what they are trying to tell. So, for example, and I'll give you a very simple example. Have you guys heard of Brantford? It's a city about an hour out of Toronto. There was a gay couple that wanted some professional photos done for their wedding. Okay, what happened? The photographers said, unfortunately, we don't do this kind of thing. We wish you the best in your marriage. Like and I actually read the message because it was all over. It was a very pleasant message. It wasn't, we don't like your kind or anything hateful, right? Just unfortunately, we're not able to do this kind of thing. It doesn't go with our values. Very simple. What happens? They took the email, they blasted it online, they got canceled essentially, that photography studio. So they actually had to close their business down. They were literally called racists and bigots. We're living in 2020, how dare they do this, right? It was now no longer, because it wasn't that full. You can tolerate them. They weren't being mean to them. They weren't being rude or evil towards them. They're just saying, we don't follow this and we can't work with this kind of thing.
No, but I get it. I think about if I was in their shoes, I wouldn't send an email like this. It's like, I'm sorry, we're like, you don't need to, you need to see it from the other person's perspective. They're very sensitive to whatever it is going on, right?
Yeah.
So they will take anything you say and just turn it against you, right? And because 90% of our people just don't get anything beyond the first sentence, we get into a situation like this. So I think the photographer position, right or wrong, he definitely presented himself in the wrong way. Right?
Okay, so
he created a backlash against himself. Like for example, we're fasting. I'm taking a trip and I'm sitting with people and we have to eat. So I really have to make a big deal whether I have to, eat this or that. No, you can accomplish what you want without making it the point of contention, right? So this person, he created a backlash unnecessarily. Like you can accomplish what you're. If this is against your value, good for you. Don't do it, but you don't have to advertise it this way.
So 2 points to that. First, I will not disagree with what you're saying. Like I agree with you. The whole purpose of us is not to change our values or our beliefs, no matter what the outside source. What I'm saying is that the outside source, unfortunately, is trying to change it, right? And this is how they do it. But now my other question for you, and this could be a very good case study question. How would you have responded? that would have not caused that question.
I'm sorry, just, we're not equipped with theories for busy that day. Like, this, like, from a, like, a business perspective, like, we don't have anybody available to do this work. Like, there is, like, they're not gonna go and check everything, every single commitment, not a day, just like, you don't need to provide an explanation as to why you can't, no lie.
Yeah.
Great, right? But that doesn't mean you have to always provide an explanation, like I'm sure we'll all come across a situation where I'm sorry I can't. And the story done, right? But sometimes the more you provide information, or the more you talk, the more you basically create trouble for yourself. And that applies to this, not just a spiritual, but this, in every scenario of life. Sometimes it's better to say less to avoid this kind of damage, right?
And that's a very good point. I definitely agree with you on that, and that sometimes you have to, just to protect yourself a little bit, you might need to find other ways to minimize.
Yeah, just I have, because I just read a couple articles about that the past few days. It's not about the communication, how we avoid it, how not, the homosexuals clearly are defending their own value. Sure, you're trying to shy away, which is fine.
No, I'm not saying shy away.
But we have an existing situation, a current situation going on for the football side. The FIFA, the 9 teams now are getting together to hold the rainbow on the shirts. And we all know that Qatar is a Middle Eastern, very Islamic and wherever. So there was two factors that the FIFA has posted in Qatar. The alcohol is eventually Qatar agreed to dispense alcohol during the matches in certain areas and so restrictions. But the other one is the acceptance of Islam.
Yeah.
And what did you gotta do for the people coming in and how we don't stop then that congregation of the people and how that has shown that. It's very, very interesting to see how an Islamic state like Qatar was kind of defend their own values against the factories for the 1 month duration dependence happening.
I actually didn't.
Yeah, actually, right on the spot for this.
I see this from a different perspective. I see this as any person in any society need to respect the law of the land, right? So, unfortunately, in our land now, homosexuality is an acceptable thing, right? We can advocate against it, for the reasons of our belief. But when you meet somebody who is in it, really, is it our business to change their mind? Is it something that we have to fight it in public? Like, for example, this is a true story. Like I'm a little older than most of you guys, so I have 2 teenager kids, right? One of their very good friends, their parents are 2 gays, married, right? They got invited to the university. So they come to me very hesitant, like my daughter was very hesitant. Like, we were invited to this birthday party, and this person, we just found out a couple of days ago that he has 2 fathers. Should we go or not? Right? So that is the same point. So now, you talk about you need to implant the culture, like to your point, we're saying, this is something that we need to talk to kids. All of, culture comes from, or the values come from too much repetition, if you will. So my answer to them is no, we're not going, because if I say we're not going, right there, I create distance, right? So what I'm saying is we need to avoid the friction, right? This person and you're them kind of created friction. My position, or the way I like to handle something like this, is avoid the friction. Have this conversation. It's like, okay, what do you see? Do you see this as like right or wrong? Is this something that matches our values? Is this something that works with our children? Is this something that would be acceptable?
right? And they answered no to every single one of them, and they know it's wrong. But at the end of the day, the question is, should we speak to this person? Like, sure, like, we're not gonna pick and choose who to talk to, right? So what I'm trying to get you is, you can present you teach the kids how to handle situations, but by asking them questions related to what we have to say, but we don't have to create confrontation or conflict for unnecessarily, right? This photographer is not gonna change the behavior of two gay or two lesbian or whatever that is, right? He's not, like, we know this as a fact. So why make a battle that doesn't lead to anything?
But they are trying to change it.
But they did not try, they say, they said, like,
Yes, you are.
they say you have to be a gay. I don't think they have.
No, but the acceptance of their values, which initially we didn't have these values. Now accepting their values, because they're posting them. But that's what we call it. We're not talking about the topic, the value of being a discussion.
Yeah.
But it is the values, it is how, I think what Theo was trying to say, or what this about is how values invade each other and take grounds against each other, not by personal interactions. I took the hotline of civics act, we had for a teenager having a relation or having a friendship, and contrasting opposite position in yours.
No. But how does it react?
I believe that regardless how regardless how good the person is, there must be something effective in behind the scene. And it's just waiting for the right time to come up.
Sure.
And I'm not exposing my kids into that. I said, it's better to step away, keep the population, don't be a hater, because we're not, but just try to stay on.
I agree. So the difference is, I think the difference between the two approaches, you said no, lucky for you, they accepted the no, right? What will happen if they don't? The way I see it is, ask these kind of questions, right? And repeat them a number of times. So what happens is, like, if I continue my own story, you know what happened? Like, there was less than a month later, they said, you know what, he was this person, like, that's everything he said.
Yeah.
Something came up, right? So it just all about, I think, if you want to maintain the values, it's not about forcing it, it's just about.
But defending it,
Yeah,
we defend it.
Yeah.
We are defending it. We're not forcing it.
But
We are defending it. In my opinion, homosexual community is actually forcing it to gain grounds. That's the logical.
yes, and I'm not defending them. Don't get me wrong. If it's a choice of mine, I wouldn't raise it. But because they are around us and we know we are not going to be in a position to change their mind, so avoid them, but without creating unnecessary confrontation. That's my only point. I'm not saying that, you know, I'm not trying to defend it. I'm just saying, why big a battle that you know you're never going to win?
So, and this was actually a really good discussion point, and I really enjoyed this because it's actually going to be part of our other case study later on. So this was kind of me jumped ahead. But what I was trying to get at all together with this is that the worldview that is outside sometimes tries to affect our internal worldview, and we don't even notice it. So I can tell you firsthand from going to university here, right? It is very liberal, and they do try to push towards the liberalistic view that if you do not follow, then you are against. And that's quite literally what they say. If you are not with us, you are against us. If you do not, support the gay rights movement, you are against gay rights. And unfortunately, I'm not saying that's every single person you talk to is going to say that, but the overall value. So I have seen this time and time again with businesses. I've seen this time and time again. And there's other businesses that have just stood quiet. And good for them. They've been able to continue without necessarily causing a whole issue, right? But there's all places where if you don't do this, then that means they're putting words in your mouth, essentially, right? They're saying, since you didn't say anything, we're going to assume that you meant ABC. And so, unfortunately, it's when this happens day after day, month after month, year after year, that can start to erode a little bit of your own personal values. Hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully, you are steadfast in your beliefs. But what we're saying is that the outside culture will try to always infect your inner culture to assimilate or get you to be part of their culture. That's what.
And that's a very good point. That's exactly what I'm trying to get to with this whole idea. I'm trying to get to a point is our role, I think, is not about teaching our children to pick a fight. Our role is to teach our children to stick to the facts.
Absolutely.
Right? Because they will not be able to pick every fight they do it. But if we can get them to maintain their values, that's I think this is a change we can, right? So maintain the values. If their values are maintained, this will affect their behavior. And when the behavior is maintained, it will affect the symbol. And guess what? When the behavior is maintained, it will influence other people around.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%.
I think we're in agreement of that.
We were always in agreement. So, is it safe to say you guys understand this little circle chart? You guys understand how the world views what is real, that core affects everything on the outside? Excellent. So, now that we've talked about culture, we understand culture. Why is it so important? The first is culture is so deeply ingrained in us. Whether we believe it or not, it is ingrained. Right? One thing I love is if you look at any immigrant aunt or uncle, what do they always say when something happens, like something sudden? Just sudden. The Islam, right? In the name of the cross. Right? That is a cultural thing that's been so ingrained in them, whether they know it or not. Right? It also guides our decision making, even if we do not realize it. Again, a lot of Egyptians, whether we like to say it or not, are pharmacists, doctors, engineers, right? Just a vast majority of us are, because it affected our decision making, right? And it's also one of the main ways we can understand experiences and to understand the culture that influences the youth on a daily basis is by understanding their culture. So what we consider taboo, a lot of other cultures might not consider taboo, right? Even when we talk about the emphasis on sexual misconduct, the Middle East has a very big no-no on sexual misconduct, whereas Western civilization is very like, oh, do what you do, right? Why is that? Why do you think that is? Because let's put it vice versa. The Western culture, oh yeah.
I think kind of the West is more advanced than the Middle East.
Okay, what else?
Like widely advanced.
Well, you mentioned that they're advanced, so what makes them more advanced? What makes the West more advanced than the East?
They're just like headed into like it's more like equality. Like there's so for example, like Middle East, if you're a person of color,
Yeah.
so it's like when I went to Egypt when I was a kid, I grew up in Canada my whole life, like I was born. So yeah, so like I was like the white kid at church, right? Like I didn't was like church doing I was like the darkest person in my group. So like when I went to Egypt, I was like I could tell like I was a target. In Canada, I don't feel like I'm a target. I feel like I'm everyone else. That's what I'm like. It's kind of more diverse. Like even like women's are having like I don't talk about like women rights in Canada. Like literally,
So-
the Middle East.
And that's great that you mentioned that women's rights. So let's dig down a little bit deeper from that. You mentioned women's rights are different in the Middle East than it is here in Western culture.
Yeah.
Why is that? Let's again think of those world views that
Because I was talking about that. I think in Egypt, they're more worried about like what they're gonna. It's like it's not like a vertical country, so they're more worried about what they're gonna eat or like what's gonna be, but like how they're gonna survive in a sense, rather than like themselves. Like rather than like the problems they have a bigger problem than like diversity or like quality and stuff like that.
So I'm gonna ask you a question. The Western culture, what is the main religious base that it started on?
Christianity.
Judeo-Christian. The Middle East, what is its main base?
Islam.
Islam. Very good. So in Islam, is sexual conduct okay in their eyes? We just said in Dubai, or sorry, where was it? Qatar. You know, they are not okay with homosexuality. Where does that come from? Actually comes from the Quran as well. Like they are very big. Like if you are gay, like they are very against that. If you are this, like sexual misconduct in the Quran is very big no-no. If you even look at how it's affected some of the Coptic Christians, we'll say Coptic Christians are more, we'll say, reserved when it comes to sexual misconduct than other Orthodox faiths. If we look at the Greek Orthodox Russian, not to say that, you know, they're okaying it, no one's saying it's okay, but you can see that there's almost a little bit of that Islamic culture that's affected us to make us a little more shy towards, you know, sexual misconduct. Whereas, you know, in Islam, you know, they cover themselves for a specific reason because they don't want to show this sexual misconduct, right? So we can almost say that part of the reason some of these things is we go back to those worldviews, what they view as real, what they view as right and wrong, right? So in the Western culture, it might be, we can say, more secular. They've removed God out of the equation. They've removed God out of the equation. They've removed that issue of sexual misconduct. Whereas in the Middle East, we can say God is still very much in the equation. And so their religion is telling them homosexuality is wrong, premarital sex is wrong, whatever it is wrong, they're still extrapolating. You can also say now they are becoming more and more liberal. As you said, maybe advancement of technology, but what does technology do? It opens you up to, exposes you to different cultures, to different educational systems, right? And then that leads back to their belief system. I found my belief told me that this was wrong, but I'm seeing people in the West doing it and it's completely fine, no one's died yet. So maybe my belief isn't all that right. And it starts growing in.
Like, so for example, I don't see growth in like society, it's like you grow up with a lot of gay friends, like, you know, friends, gay, but I'm not gonna hate them, I'm not gonna be like, yo, I'm not gonna be friends with you because they're gay, like, I know what I like,
Yeah.
like, I'm not gonna move towards them like that, like, it's like that, like, if you like what they like, I'm not gonna, like, you only need to be afraid of at the end of the day. So, like, it doesn't make me not want to be friends with them, because I don't like them for, like, I like them for their personality, like, I'm trying to make friends with their personality.
So end of the day, and let's be clear, we love everyone, right? We love everyone, we hate the sin, right? But what I'm just trying to get at is the culture, right? And understanding why something is more taboo than others. We can also say, even if you look at homosexuality back in the 1950s, it was very not okay in the West because they were more centered around that Judeo-Christian culture. It's now become more secularized. As the Middle East becomes more secularized, I can tell you now, they're going to be more and more exposed to homosexuality and to other types of sexual misconduct, and they're going to be more okay with it. That's unfortunately part of what the culture is bringing to that society, right? So what we're trying to say is religion will affect the culture, right? So why is it that people might be resistant to Christian culture? Any ideas? Restrictions. They're seeing it as restrictions. So what's another way we can say it based on what we were talking about with the circles? What is the Christian culture trying to go against? To say someone who is not Christian. Behaviors, what else? It might literally go against their worldview, that very core. So I'm gonna give you guys a funny example of marriage. So you have been raised your whole life to fold your laundry this way. Your wife comes and she says, no, you're doing it wrong. You're supposed to fold it this way. Is that a personal attack on you? It's not. But you will feel like it is because your mom was telling you how to do this. So are you telling me that my mom was wrong in teaching me how to do it? Are you telling me that my dad, the way he was doing it was wrong? No, I do not accept this. You will find that kind of thing where when someone tries to change something, it can be so mundane or so simple. But if it's different from what you were taught or raised with and goes against it, you will become very defensive right away. You become defensive, yes.
I think the thing that causes like religion or like Christianity or Christians to be hated, it's like the history, how like the Canada and the United States were kind of built, they were built off like slavery, right? And people that were going to the cross were Catholics, right? and the privilege.
Yeah.
Right, so that kind of made a resentment. So for example, like, what happened recently with the
Indigenous
people, right? They were saying the Catholic Church that brought a lot of hate to the Catholic Church, and then resulted to, I think, Orthodox Church getting burned in Vancouver. Yeah. So that's something like it's also like history because of like back in the day, I think like the Catholic Church wasn't really a church, it was just power. So that kind of showed kind of hatred towards future Catholic people in the future. That's what I think another reason why people don't like Christians.
And I think to this very point, the problem is, and the problem is the way the media was, because yes, the church is responsible, the people of the church are responsible for very much all the problems you mentioned with the original indigenous people. The reality is that's not the church. Right? So the church teaching unfortunately does not apply in most of this. So now a church representative comes up and ruins the reputation of the church, right? But the media doesn't present it in a way that makes it personal behavior, makes it a church behavior. So you made it sound like the church at its core is teaching people to do that. And that's one other thing that we can achieve. Like if you talk about what we can do and what we can do, is we can bring some light to the distinction between what the church is teaching and what people of the church are doing, because they're not necessarily the same thing. You know what Gandhi said, I love Christianity, but I hated Christians.
Yeah.
So that's very true. This is the exact same problem.
So what I'm trying to get at is, and you guys are absolutely right, that these are lots of factors, but when we're talking about something that's challenging culture, I want you to take out the politically correctness and whatnot, but what is it at the core? Why is it people are resistant to say someone that tells you, I want to be a Christian, right? Or I want you to become a Christian. What are the values that they're trying to change? So if your whole life you were, again, a homosexual, and you're telling you should be a Christian, right? It's going against your worldview because you've always viewed as homosexuality as right. So if you've always viewed it as right, and then someone's coming and telling you it's wrong, you're like, I can't believe in this, right? So as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of restrictions, as they say it, or a lot of people see Christianity as say restricted to their freedom, right? And so that might be something that's very difficult for us to try to bring our culture, the Christian culture, into their beliefs, right? So I've heard a lot from this side, which is great. Let's hear more from this side. How would you try to challenge someone's culture? How would you try to challenge a culture then to bring them more towards a Christian culture? Any ideas? Remember, there's no right or wrong answer.
You have to very perspective and people are believe.
Okay.
And we should respect and we say that they're different. And it's okay for people, and not everybody will have the same view. So we definitely not agree on things, but we should, you know,
Like speak louder.
or maybe explain our worldview so that we can understand each other. And that needs a bit more building conversation rather than communication to interpret.
No, that's great. Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's more of starting from the common ground, starting from the person who believes, like, that's why what people that believe, like, pretty similar, we starting from their first refugee rate, and then starting to look into the difference.
No, I like that. Yeah.
I think it's very significant, very easy to show like a sign of understanding what they think, because they were saying about trust or like they're all really strong in one relationship. And that will then from their understanding and perspective and whatever else they might
yeah, I feel like, yeah, you got a person, like, you don't want to go in with the intention with this movie that it will be very there. Because the end of the day, it's having advice. I mean, they're also going to be biased. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think have to start with understanding what the popular. Yeah, go in with the intention of having a conversation.
And I appreciate what you guys all said. This was great because you all mentioned a few things, building that trust, finding the common grounds, understanding them before you just jump right in, right? That makes such a big difference for someone who's about to have a conversation with you. I remember, I'll tell you guys two stories. One, when I was in York University, there was an Egyptian person who found out, like, you're from Egypt, I'm from Egypt too. He was Muslim, right? And so I remember I was really surprised about this. Like, let's go for a coffee one time. Like, sure, why not? Right? Go for a coffee, and then he was like, I want to talk to you about, Christianity and stuff. Okay, it's like, I know, like, these Protestant people, like, and they're St. Paul, they screwed up. Like, St. Paul is just out there. I was like, no, St. Paul is right. There's nothing wrong with St. Paul. Like, Protestants, they might have different beliefs, or they might have a few different things, but St. Paul, the gospel, it's not wrong, right? But the first thing he did was kind of go into, this is wrong. Obviously, right away, like, there's no common ground, right? And that becomes very difficult. So right away, it's like he was trying to bring his own culture into mind, but because he came in with resistance, it didn't work. Another story, I had a friend of mine who wasn't gay, but she knew me, I was a Christian, and she wanted to have, and we were talking, and we ended up having this conversation about gays. And I found it very interesting because she was ready for a fight. She was very like, I want to hear you say how the church hates gay people and they're gonna all go to hell and this and that, right? And the first thing I said is, first, we're all sinners, just because someone's gay doesn't mean that, that is the one sin and that's the only thing that's like, no, it's, I am a sinner just as much. Anyone who commits a type of adultery is a sinner, right? When I started going to that, it's like, okay. And then I started going into, how the church doesn't hate people. Right? We love people. We don't like sin, just like stealing, just like lying, just like this, just like that. We don't agree with these things, right? But the person, just like myself, I like to believe that God still loves me despite all my flaws, despite my sin. Right? Now it became a very different conversation. It wasn't a let's get ready for a fight, right? It was let's have a discussion. And whether or not I changed her worldview, whether or not I changed anything in the end, but at least she was able to have a conversation with me about homosexuality. I could say my beliefs without her thinking I was hateful, I was racist, I was sexist, I was homosexual, or whatever. I was homophobic, there we go, that's the word. Whatever it was, right? There wasn't that there, right? Because we came from a point, like you said, where we built trust. We talked about, the similarities and what we can agree on. Right? These things help when we're trying to go and challenge a culture. Because it's already, if you're challenging a culture, that's a big deal. If you're telling someone essentially what their view was wrong, it's very hard to change that. So if I go guns blazing, that's not going to work. Just like the youth nowadays. If there's something that they're doing, and I always find this very interesting because there's two things you can do. You can either try to like, oh, it's okay, Habibi. That's not what we want to do. Right? But at the same time, we want to try to make sure that they feel comfortable, that they can speak to us. Because if you go and say, what you're doing is wrong, right? They might not feel comfortable to speak to you again about this topic, right? So when we talk about how we change these different things, there's the symbols, the behaviors, the values, the beliefs, and the worldviews. That's how we challenge the culture. We challenge it through all the different things. In the end, the most lasting challenge or the most lasting change is when we can affect the worldview. Because remember, when we affect the worldview, that is the core. If we can affect the core, that can bring about changes to everything else. I can affect the outside, that doesn't mean I'll affect the inside. Right? We're actually talking a little bit about modernism and postmodernism today, and we're going to see how that has changed worldviews altogether, and it's very interesting. I also like to talk about when we talk about challenging the culture. I love talking about St. Anthony. So Saint Anthony is my favorite saint by all means. And when you look at him as how he challenged a culture, a worldview, it's very interesting. Can anyone think of Saint Anthony? What was he very well known for? Was he a good public speaker? Does anyone know this? Was he the one that's always on the pulpit? No. He led by his actions. He did speak, he actually wrote a lot of great things, and I'm sure he was very powerful in his messages, but that wasn't his main source of change. His main source was, I'm going to go into the middle of nowhere. I'm going to show people how to be a monastic. And he made changes through his actions. So sometimes that's what it takes to change a worldview. If everyone around them, if say I am someone who is lost, and everyone around me is acting the same, but there is one person that I'm seeing that is different, that is unique, that is instilling, that is happy in what they are doing, that can actually make me question things. Saint Anthony, I love there's one thing, if you ever read the life of Saint Anthony, it says that he's in the desert for 20 years. And when he's in the desert for 20 years, it's not like he keeps popping in and out of the desert and saying, hi, everyone, remember me? He's been in the desert for that long without communication with people. And yet, he comes out of his tomb, and there's a multitude of people around him saying, I want to live your life. How is that possible? Right? Obviously, it's through God. Through God, all things are possible. But he never had to give a sermon. He showed people that he was able to do all this with his actions. And then others said, I want to live your life, saying that. And that's how other people started following his worldview. And so it's amazing what sometimes we can do with our actions outside of just words. So different kinds of cultures and how they interact. So this is kind of again, these are all in your books, like any of these pictures that you see, they're all in the textbooks, so you'll find it. So as you can see, there's Christian culture, church culture, kingdom culture, and world culture. So liberalism, what kind of culture is that? It's the world culture, okay? Christian culture, what would an example of Christian culture be? What? I wouldn't say necessarily communion, because there's a lot of Protestants that don't believe in communion.
The liturgy.
Again, there's a lot of gospel. So when I'm talking about culture, it's something that's been influenced maybe by the gospel, right? So the gospel, and maybe I should go from the center, maybe that'll make it a little bit easier. Kingdom culture. Kingdom culture is what everything else has come out from, right? So if we're talking about kingdom culture, someone mentioned the gospel, right? So the Bible is part of that kingdom, right? So whatever the Bible has been written, what's been written down in the Bible, that is part of our core kingdom culture, what's taught us a lot about everything else. So what's brought forth a lot of the other types of culture that we see here. Yes. That's perfect. Jesus is the kingdom culture. What Jesus has said, what Jesus has taught, that is the kingdom culture. All right? What else? What else can be kingdom culture? The goal of getting to heaven. So becoming, that's right. That's maybe a better way to say. The goal of getting to heaven, that is a kingdom culture. I want to get to heaven so I can be closer to God. My goal, and I always like to say this, the goal is not to be in heaven, it's to be with Christ. Right? That is the goal. If my goal is I want to be in heaven, sometimes people might mistake it as a materialistic goal, where it's like, oh, I just want to hit this goal and then I'm done. Right? What I love is when they say the kingdom of heaven is within us. Right? It says that in the Bible. They're trying to say if when you are with God, that is heaven. That is what heaven is all about. That's why Saint Anthony could be in a desert, yet he is the happiest man in the world. Because he is with God. He's living with God. Right? So that's great. So we talk about kingdom culture. So Jesus, the Bible, those things, that's the kingdom. That's our core values. That's where everything comes from. Then we talk about the church culture. So look at the church culture. Sunday school, okay. Very good. I actually probably argue that might be more Christian culture because that can apply to all denominations, right? What could a church culture be? Yes.
Fasting during Easter.
Great. Fasting. Does every church have fasting? And I'm talking about Catholic, Protestant, like what kinds of fasts they do. No, they don't. So church culture, fasting could be one of them. Yes. The Agpeya, that is a unique thing. Not every church has an Agpeya to pray for. What else could be a church culture?
Icons.
Icons could be a church culture. Very good. What else? Sacraments. Absolutely. Sacraments are a church culture. Now, let's talk about Christian culture. What could Christian culture be? It's a little bit difficult. Not necessarily. Prayer. So just praying, that is a Christian cultural value, right? Everyone can pray. Yes. So it might be more church culture, right? The Bible, remember we said that's one of the kingdom cultures, right? So the Bible is a kingdom culture.
Service.
Service, yes, serving others, serving the poor, serving the needy. That is great. And then we see world culture. So what is so unique about this world culture? What is so unique about this little center over here where we see world culture and that other circle connects? It's very, but what does it mean when we see that the world culture can intersect with these two sections? What does that mean?
There are people in the world who are Christians, but they have something to say.
Okay, very good. Let's reverse that. What else does that mean? We have common grounds with other people, but also mean that we can change some of the church culture and Christian culture based off of what the world culture could be at the time. And a good example is a Greek Orthodox church, a Russian Orthodox church, a Coptic Orthodox church. Do we all have the exact same service? Do we have the exact same liturgies? No. We all have our own liturgies based on our culture, which could have been the world culture at the time. So the Coptic church, they have the Triento and Death, right? Because that's what our world culture, we were using those instruments at the time. You go to an Ethiopian Orthodox church, you might see they have drums, right? So it doesn't mean that world culture is always bad. I just want to point that out. But what I'm saying is that the church culture, the Christian culture, can be affected by the world, right? So this also means that Christian culture, unfortunately, like as we're seeing right now, there are some churches that are allowing homosexual marriages to happen, right? So this is where it gets, again, to the negative side. So like I said, the world culture isn't always bad, but we start to take more and more of the world culture and put it in to that Christian culture and church culture, that's where we can see some damaging results. Now, let's put it one other step. What do you notice that's unique about this picture? What's going on with the kingdom culture? The kingdom culture is the truth. It is Jesus. It is unchanging. Whatever happens in the outside, that can happen in the outside, but Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Jesus, his mission will not change. Someone can tell you, oh, Jesus was here to be a friend. That's all. No, he was here to save us from sin. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If a church tells you otherwise, that means it might have been affected by the world culture. But our kingdom culture, that stays the same. It does not change. That culture has to stay the same. Because if that starts to get corrupted by the world culture, we lose everything. We lose absolutely everything. And so it's very important when you're seeing these different things to understand what is the kingdom culture, because the kingdom culture is that root for us. That is our basis of our faith. Right? Everything else, that comes from this. So if someone tells me, again, oh, St. Paul actually meant A, B, C, D, E in the gospel, or in the Praxis. That's not okay. That is maybe a Christian culture saying, oh, they're contextualizing based on the world culture at this time. This is what St. Paul meant, right? But that's not the case, because we know that the Bible is true as it was yesterday, as it is today. It does not change. Its message does not change. It is not up for interpretation. So it is there to stay there. So when, Jesus says, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven unless you are baptized, right? It's not up for debate. Well, maybe Jesus meant it only in this situation and this. No, he meant it. It's why when Jesus says, if you do not eat of my body and drink my blood, right, you cannot be a part of it. And you see right after in one of the readings, you hear that many people that day followed him no more. What does that mean? People heard him say that and thought he was crazy and left. So when a Protestant comes and says, oh, Jesus never really meant to physically eat his body and blood, he didn't mean that. He was just saying a symbolic reference. It's like, no, there's actual times in the Bible that says people were scared of this because they did not want to understand it or did not want to accept it, and they followed him no more. So our Bible, our Gospels, it is not up for interpretation. Christ is not up for interpretation. Our faith is not up for interpretation. Unfortunately, as I said, the church culture and Christian culture can be affected by this. Okay? Now, the next little part, I'm going to show you guys a video of a pastor. He's a Protestant pastor. He goes and uses this contextualization to fit the gospel into the worldview. And again, this is very dangerous because what he is doing is he's trying to fit God. He's trying to almost take away that kingdom culture and bring it to something else. We know that is not correct. It is actually very dangerous. It is what a lot of people that become heretics actually end up doing because they are trying to fit the kingdom culture within our thought process. We can even use Arius as an example. Arius could not understand how is it that Jesus is God and he is the highest of the high, and he didn't understand it. So no, Jesus has to be a demigod. We're just below God the Father. Because he couldn't understand it, so he was trying to change the kingdom culture. And we know the end result is he's a heretic. Right? A lot of this contextualization you also have to understand is it doesn't come from anyone who just wants to say whatever. A lot of these people are very educated. A lot of these people understand the church culture, understand the Christian culture. And that's how they're working towards this change. That's where it becomes very tricky, but sometimes it's very hard to defend your point of ground. That's why we learn apologetics, so we can understand our kingdom culture and be able to defend it so that we can keep our church culture aligned with the kingdom culture and to keep our Christian culture aligned with the kingdom culture. Because the last thing you want is to be part of that contextualization. I always say I hated it when I was in high school and the teacher would say, what do you think the writer meant at this time? It's like, he might have just meant this. It might not have to do with real world problems that are going on right now. Right? So this video I'm going to show you, again, this is in no way something that I agree with, but this is what is being said. And as I said, the gospel transcends the culture, and the presentation of the gospel incorporates culture. So this is a different point. The person who is writing the gospel, whether it's St. John, St. Mark, Matthew, Luke, any one of them, they're writing with their own cultural understanding at the time. Something else we have to also understand is what we are reading is a translation of what they wrote. Right? So sometimes a Greek word might not have the best explanation in English. That's why we always say, and you'll hear a lot of priests, Orthodox priests, they'll actually go back to the original translation to understand what was the real meaning of the word at the time. And you also have to look at it back at that time. What were they trying to say? What was the message that was trying to be sent? Right? Because again, the gospel is not up for interpretation. And unfortunately, this person, he puts the gospel up for interpretation. That's where we get into a problem. And how many of you guys can hear it?
Yeah, you're probably going to change the way the output. That's what we because
How do I do that? Thank you. Bear with me, guys. Hopefully, you guys can hear it.
Part of the Gospel of Mark where Jesus uses a racial slur. In Mark chapter 7, there's the account of the Syrophoenician woman, a woman who was Syrian and Greek, both of which there were strong biases against the Jewish community. And she goes to ask Jesus to heal her daughter who's possessed by a demon. And what is Jesus' response? He says, it's not good for me to give the children's food, meaning the children of Israel's food, to dogs. He calls her a dog. What's amazing about this account is that the woman doesn't back down. She speaks truth to power. She confronts Jesus and says, well, you can think that about me, but even dogs deserve the crumbs from the table. Her boldness and bravery to speak truth to power actually changes Jesus' mind. Jesus repents of his racism and extends healing to this woman's daughter. I love this story because it's a reminder that Jesus is human. He had prejudices and bias, and when confronted with it, he was willing to do his work. And this woman was willing to stand up and say, a part of the gospel.
So it's very skewed understanding of what happened, right? Jesus is not a racist. Even the term the dog, if you go back to the Greek word, it's not quite like how we use the term a dog. There's actually two different types of words, and it's very interesting. So there's actually I have the subsplasher, right? Basically a sermon on this specifically by a Coptic priest talking about this specific like gospel reading, and it's very well explained. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the bottom line is that no, this is a very, again, contextualized way of understanding the gospel reading to fit the narrative of today, where racism is such a big hot topic, right? We want to be PC, we want to be culturally normal and accepting of all cultures. And so I'm going to show you guys how Jesus sinned. It's like, no, Jesus doesn't sin. Again, he is trying to affect that kingdom culture, right? And so you have to be very careful. And so just one thing I do want to mention, by knowing that the gospel transcends culture, as we said, because it's part of that kingdom, right? It's that core value that does not change, right? We're able to bring the good news to everyone. And that's kind of the nice part. The gospel being something that's closed off, and when I say closed off, it's not up for interpretation, it's part of our kingdom culture. It can actually be brought to everyone. And we've seen that. The gospel has spread all over the world. Right? Because, again, it is unchanged. If it was very specific to Jewish culture and that's it, it might have been very difficult for, the Egyptians, for example, to accept the gospel, right? So that's one thing. And while the content of the gospel remains unchanged, its presentation can vary depending on the culture of those whom it's being communicated. So all people, including young people, have the right to have the gospel presented to them in a form that is relevant and meaningful. But at the same time, if it's not put in check, it can be used for evil. It can be misinterpreted and misread, and people can come to their own conclusions based on the current culture, which is what happened here. Right? So it's very important that we understand that when we're talking about, again, the gospel, about who Jesus is, that kingdom culture, remember, it cannot change. And if you ever hear it changing, that is a big red flag. If you see a youth that is trying to understand, and he or she is saying something about that kingdom culture and it is directly against what we believe, that is a big red flag that you have to make sure gets turned around immediately. Because if you try to interrupt that, everything else is lost. It makes our faith worse. Where do we get all our church culture from? Kingdom. So if the kingdom culture now is broken, our church culture is broken. If our church culture is broken, our Christian culture is broken. Everything is broken. So we just finished talking about culture. That's basically the first, 30 or 40 pages of the book. We're going to now get into pre-modernism and modernism. It's 5:10. I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes because I know I've been talking a lot. Take a break, washroom break, whatever you need, and then we'll reconvene at 5:20. Okay? 6 o'clock. Views. This is the base of how we're going to do what's up in the week, how we're going to understand this, right? Because as we know, world culture is always going to keep changing, and we're going to have to be able to adapt to it. And the other part is understanding how we apply what we've learned to their culture. Now we're going to talk about the different cultures throughout the centuries and how it's been affected by what was going on in them. So the first thing we're going to talk about is pre-modernism. right? You guys have heard of modernism, pre-modernism, postmodernism. Have you guys heard of those terms? Very good. So pre-modernism was basically they believed in divine revelations for answers. That means everything was from God. That's what they all believed. Everyone had that faith that there was a God. So you look at the ancient Greeks, they had Zeus. Zeus was their main god of the ancient Greek gods. Go to Norse mythology. The Egyptians had the ancient gods, right? Everyone had their gods and everything came from the gods. Why is the Nile flooding? Because this god is causing the Nile to flood. Why is this happening? Because Zeus is throwing thunderbolts from the sky, right? There was reasons for everything, but it was all God, right? And so the ultimate source of truth was God, and this lasted until the 16th century, right? At this time, religious authority had the most power because they were the people who received the truth. What we find is that a lot of people in the world, how it works, it's whoever knows the truth, they're the people that are revered the most, or the people who are respected the most. So we can look at throughout the years how it's changed. But pre-modernism, just remember, to them, God was the truth. So anything that came from God, that was the truth. Then we go into modernism. Modernism, we start to see a big shift on how people saw what is true, right? And from before, at the time, from seeking religious figures, they started moving towards their own personal knowledge or the knowledge of man. So they believe in scientific discovery. They believe that everything has to be based on empirical evidence. If I can see, touch, taste, smell, feel, or not feel, see, touch, taste, or smell, that was what was true, right? So instead of faith in God, there was faith in the power of man. And it challenged the church's supremacy. So from the 16th century to the 20th century, this is where modernism starts. It's also where the sciences start to flourish. So during this time, we see the Renaissance, we see where all the big theories start to come into play, where we start to understand the world around us because, again, we're believing in the power of man. Truth comes from man in modernism. And so the time of pre-modernism was complete obedience to the church, and anything else was seen as evil or not true. And so the unifying force of culture was the church. And modernism allowed that to change. So what we're saying is what there was a church, had all the control in the world, then modernism comes, it starts showing that maybe God isn't the answer to everything. And if God isn't the answer to everything, then maybe the church might be wrong. And this is where we start to see modernism, and we look at like this again. Between that 16th century to the 20th century, we're talking about, say, Darwinism. That was a big issue with the church, right? Not that the church didn't believe in everything or it disagreed or agreed, but it's, people saw the church, believed in this, the world saw a different view or showed evidence of something else, therefore, they contradicted. What do we believe in as a church? Is that God gave us science to use it to understand. So science and God should not contradict. And we know that for a fact that science does change time after time. Right? What I always found very interesting was how when we're talking about how the world was made and everything, there's actually a little excerpt from Job that talks about how the world is made. And at first, it went against what the belief of science was at the time. And then they started finding other evidence to say maybe that is how it was made, right? So the concept is what I'm trying to get at is in modernism, again, it is based on empirical evidence only, nothing else. And so this is where the church actually at the time faced a lot of struggle. Maybe not necessarily the Coptic church, but the Roman Catholic Church faced a lot of struggle at this time. Why was that? Any ideas why the Roman Catholic Church might have struggled the most during this time of modernism? Where did the Renaissance start? Exactly. So near Italy. Where did the Roman Catholic Church start? Italy. So you have people that are inventing all these amazing things, doing things that people thought was impossible before, right? I remember we were talking about those worldviews. So if all of a sudden nobody thought it was impossible to do this or build this or create this or understand this concept. And someone comes and does it, what happens? Maybe it's not impossible. So if it's not impossible, what else did the church tell me that was impossible that might actually be possible? Is the church lying to me? Right? And this becomes a problem because in the Renaissance, a lot happens. First, we talk about the Reformation. So when we talk about the Reformation, we're talking about, say, Protestantism. So we're talking about Martin Luther King. Or sorry, Martin Luther. Martin Luther, what was his main issue with the church? Remember what he did?
Like
The whole structure of the church. At the time, unfortunately, as we said, the church itself is part of the people in the church can be corrupted. At the time, there was a lot of issues going on in the church. Martin Luther didn't like that. So he posts this edict that I don't agree with any of this stuff. I don't agree with some of the sacraments or how they're being presented. I don't agree with what's being done. His plan wasn't necessarily to create a whole new subsect of Christianity. That wasn't necessarily his purpose, but unfortunately, his thought process of the Bible is now up for interpretation created this, right? Because again, it's the belief in man's power, man's knowledge. So he couldn't understand something. He wants man to understand it. So if man's going to understand it, this is how we're going to put it. This is what's going to happen. Because I need to understand it to believe it. As we said, in this era, there's Christopher Columbus who sails around the world, finds out the world isn't flat, it's circle, right? We talk about Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, great worldly, knowledgeable facts are presented to us because of these people, right? And because they went against essentially everything that people believed in at the time, it started to create problems. And when I say problems, not necessarily problems for the world, but problems for the church. Because again, the church wasn't necessarily embracing everything, their response might have actually been against it. So we see the science and humanities as well start to flourish during that time. So we start talking about, when we say humanities, we start to see it's no longer just about, how am I going to feed myself tomorrow? I can start thinking about arts. I can start thinking about all these other things. So again, you're exposing the world to a lot of new ways of thinking. The Industrial Revolution is also a big blow because, and people think of the scientific breakthrough as a two-part way in how it was changing that world view. One was, again, things that shouldn't have been created were being created at the time, right? But on top of that, it was allowing that people to connect with other cultures and other communities so much more easily. Think about it before. Phones were like, even we'll talk about the 90s, the early 90s, like the phone was the only way to communicate with people. You have to go get a phone card to call someone in Egypt and all that. Now it's I have WhatsApp, I can call them quickly, I can see what's going on, right? So this kind of industrial revolution that also happened back then started affecting that. There were a lot of philosophers such as Karl Marx. Does anyone know who Karl Marx is? No? Yeah. So can you tell me what is his big thing? What was he like known for? Yeah, so he had this theory. He's basically the one that we can say fathered the idea of communism. But his whole thought process was if we all cooperate and work together, we can create a utopia. We can create the perfect world, right? Unfortunately, we know that, as you can see in China and Russia, it does not, right? And part of it was also that, God cannot be a part of this because who is the one that's creating the utopia? Man. Again, modernism is all about man's perfection, or man's knowledge to be perfect, right? So there's that. There's even Freud. Sigmund Freud, when we talk about the, science and humanities, he had a lot of theories. But one of them was the religious beliefs and experiences could be explained psychologically as illusions. So he's going just directly against the church, saying everything you believe is an illusion, right? So it caused a lot of people to look inwardly for truth because now they're being told, oh, this is what we can create a perfect utopia. We don't need heaven. we don't need God to create that perfect world. God is an illusion. So now people are starting to think more inwardly. It's like, maybe this is happening. Maybe I need to take God out of the equation and find more meaning in my life. Right? And so we start to see that decline in the church. And then, after the Industrial Revolution, as I mentioned, we get to the response of the church. So I find this very interesting. What was so unique about the Coptic Church during all this time, from the 16th century to the 20th century? What's going on to the Coptic Church?
Staying true to their kingdom or that, so
Exactly, but why? Why do we stay so close compared to, say, other Orthodox churches or whatnot? Or we'll say other Christian churches. Why were we not affected by the world culture around us? Or maybe we were affected by the world culture, but in a different way.
we had more projects to leave.
Exactly. Well, the rest of the world was flourishing. There was no persecution, essentially. The Coptic Church still had a ton of persecution. And when people are backed into a wall, what do they go to? That core. So they go back to the kingdom culture. So we didn't really change all that much during this time, whereas a lot of other churches might have changed. So I love there's a quote from Pope Shenouda who said like something, I can't remember, I'm paraphrasing maybe, he would say something like, thank God for the Islamic world in the Coptic Church. Why is he saying that? Because they kept the church true. We see a lot of Orthodox churches, and I'm saying Orthodox because their faith is just as Orthodox as ours, but it's changed a lot over the years, over the centuries, compared to ours. So we'll say the people are not as united to the church as the Coptic Church is. Why is that? Because again, they didn't suffer persecution. It wasn't you believe in the faith or you die for them. So they could believe in their faith and believe in something else. Right now, this is what the Coptic Church in Canada is actually facing right now. You can believe in a Coptic church, you can be a Coptic Christian, Coptic Orthodox Christian, and you can also believe in something else. And that's why we actually lose a lot of youth nowadays, because it's more allowable. It's not a one or the other, it's let's mix everything all together. So this is kind of, again, peace in the church does not always equal growth in the church. So let's put it that way. And the response of the church, and when I'm saying the church, I'm talking about the church as a whole, not the Coptic Church, not the Roman Catholic Church, just the church as a whole that was dealing with all these things that was going on in modernism. Like I said, the Coptic Church might have not necessarily had to deal with this because we were just struggling to survive. But a lot of the churches, they didn't help the cause because they didn't like the shift in power. The Roman Catholic Church, if you go to Italy, if you go to Rome specifically, there's one building where the Pope lives in. That has to be the highest point in the entire land of Rome. Why is that? Because the church is the greatest power, right? So that point has to be the highest. Every other building cannot be taller than that. Because again, the Church of Rome had all the power in Italy or in Rome, right? And so it's seen that people are starting to lose faith. People are leaving the church. They're losing power. So what do? They double down. Oh, you said the world was not flat? You are a heretic, you are a liar, you are not with God, therefore get out of the church. You're excommunicated, right? Does the world being flat or circular really matter to God? No. Does it matter to our faith? No, it does not. But the Roman Catholic Church, unfortunately, was starting to go towards that where they were going to extremes, right? It's, I'm losing power, I need to make sure I retain power. And this happens with a lot of the churches that were outside, that were being exposed to the modernism. We can even see it, again, when we have these peaceful times, this is what happens. We can even look at the ancient church. Before this point in time of when there's peace, there's usually struggles in the faith. The times of Arius, Saint Cyril, this is all after what? The age of martyrdom, right? So the age of martyrdom ends, and the church is now the state. The church has the main power, and what happens? Heretics start to rise. Issues start to rise in the church. Why is that? Because again, this is what's affecting it. And so after the decline of modernism, this is now where we start to see postmodernism start to take place. So this is the 1900s. We see a decline in modernism and the ascent of postmodernism. And it begins when there are cracks in modernism. So what's the first crack that we see? Communism was starting, right? In China and Russia and whatnot. Was it a good thing? It was not. So this whole perfect utopia that the world that humans that man can make is no longer perfect. So maybe modernism isn't the solution. So do you notice here how man is almost, it has a problem, it tries to find a solution, and it goes to the next era. So we're going now from modernism to postmodernism. So you lose the loss of ideals. So we see a lot of people who are very big on their ideals. So JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., those people, they're very big on their beliefs. And what happens to them? They get assassinated. Right? So like if you have a very strong belief, you might get killed. Right? There's wars that happen at this time. These wars also halt progress of what was been going on. So before we're seeing all the scientific revolution, we're seeing, the flourishing of the sciences. War starts, that progress stops. Everything is all about protecting yourself. And we see the fall of communism. We also see scientific uncertainty. And this was a very big blow to modernism. Because remember how I told you, we believed in man's knowledge. Then someone like Albert Einstein comes, talks about the theory of relativity, says time is not all relative. So I was like, wait, the one thing I could know is perfect at certain time is not perfect. It's not absolute, it's relative. Right? So we see these pillars of modernism starting to crack, and so it declines. And we get into postmodernism. So postmodernism can be seen as a direct reaction towards modernism. So we see the truth is relative. Before we were saying everything is empirical, right? Empirical truth. Whatever I see is the absolute truth. Now its truth is relative. The culture, right? The language, even how we speak, begins to change in postmodernism. Because of that quote, truth is relative. So what your truth is different from my truth, which is different from your truth, which is different from that person's truth. And so it no longer goes towards what is who I am, it's what am I feeling. And we can even bring this about homosexuality. If we look at, in the past, it was, I was born this way, right? Now what is homosexuality about? It's this is how I'm feeling. Transgenderism and all these other, I don't know what they're called, denominations or viewpoints of themselves, the LGBTQ, two-spirited, non-binary, it's a lot of it is feeling. How do I feel about this? So postmodernism, thinking about it is, remember, pre-modernism, all about God. God is the truth. Modernism is all about what man is the truth. Postmodernism is feelings and emotions are the truth. So how I am feeling is my personal truth. My truth is relative. My culture will give me a truth, but just because my culture gives me a truth doesn't mean that it's better than your culture. Doesn't mean it's better than your culture. It's everyone's culture has their own set of values and truth. And so this also becomes very difficult for someone that's so ingrained in the church, because the truth, the church says what? Is there multiple truths or one truth? It's one truth, right? But postmodernism is directly saying, no, there's not one truth. You might have a belief, that's your belief. You might have a truth, that is your truth. And this is what is happening. I know we had a discussion about the homosexuality and whatnot. And it's like some people will say, well, as long as they're not bothering me, they're living their life, I'm not gonna interact with it and all that. But then what happens when they start coming to you and saying, well, this is my truth, and you have to start believing in it, right? And this is where it becomes very interesting about this postmodernism. Because even though truth is relative, or we'll say everything is relative, there's one thing that is absolute, is what the cultural norm at that point. If you don't follow that cultural norm, you are outcasted. Your view is wrong. Right? And that is what's very interesting. Let me rephrase that to make it a little bit more clear. I can have my own personal truth, you can have your own personal truth, right? We're both living in separate lives, right? But right now, because media is very big on everyone has to be an ally of the LGBTQ community, right? So that means that if you don't agree with this, even though we just said what? My truth is my personal truth, your truth is your personal truth. But if you don't agree with me, you're actually wrong. So it's almost a contradiction in postmodernism that we're seeing nowadays, which is, again, very interesting because we might see another era of change coming upon us. Because even in postmodernism, there's hypocrisy in what is being said, right? So,
To this point, I wanna go back to the story you said, when the Sultan guy comes to you, and basically start to question your faith,
Yes.
right? You got very upset and got me one stuff, right?
Yeah.
So this is, I think, ties back into this conversation, we say to somebody, oh, because we're different, I don't believe in you, I don't want to deal with you. That's a non-starter too. So I think we play a role as a church to maybe not to say like a church, but as parents or servants or whatever, raise a generation that strongly believe in their beliefs, church beliefs, but at the same time willing to listen to other people so we can find the common ground. And I think, like, to this contradicting point, I totally agree with you. It's like, if I have somebody on the team that is, has whatever, sexual belief, that like, if I even try to bring it remotely, it's a non-starter. Exactly what you said. So I think this is where the church needs to play the role of finding the common ground, in a more effective way,
Absolutely.
right?
And I think that's why we're in this course, to understand so that we know how to get to that point. And this is what I love about this program. If you know the 5 different courses plus that extra one, that's a good product. That's what it's trying to gear us towards, right? This is all about just understanding what's going on, this specific course. But later on, the hope is you guys will be able to, know how to talk in a way that is effective, that you can have a conversation without offending someone, without doing all of these things. And it is very difficult because you have to tiptoe around everything to make sure that you don't upset the person so that you can continue to have a conversation. The language in postmodernism also has a very big change to it. So language is the same thing in postmodernism, that the reality of what we're saying can be subjective. What you said might have no offending term, right? But I felt offended by it, right? So in this postmodern culture, we also have to be careful what we're saying, because again, just because you meant it a certain way, that has nothing to do with the situation. It's how I felt when you said it, right? And so again, postmodern, we're seeing a lot of changes come about that we're still going through right now. And so what comes from postmodernism? There's secularism, spirituality, and selfism. So we're going to go into these 3 points very quickly. Secularism is how they view the world from a lens of not knowing who God is. We don't believe in God. Secularistic views are non-God, right? Without God, they view the world without a true absolute morality. This leads us to make our own judgment. Society decides what is true, what is morally correct, and this is imposed on a person. A great example of this is, again, abortion. Without take God out of the equation, we don't believe that God exists. If that's the case, how do you view abortions, right? It's now based on something very different. So secularism, we take God out of the equation. That happened in postmodernism. Because remember, we said truth is relative. Everything is relative. That means God, your God, is relative to whatever you believe in, not what I believe in. Then this creates topics, and the problem is this creates topics for us. And I think secularism is what we really struggle with our youth right now, because that's the topics that a lot of kids go into, right? Understanding, homosexuality, abortions, just premarital sex, everything that can affect them, right? Lying, even to the basic, like that's a very basic thing, but it's like lying is now, it depends on the situation. Maybe you might need to lie. We know absolute truth. We should not be lying. But we're being told that there are situations where you might have to. Right? Again, it's going against our actual truth. Then we get into spirituality. So spirituality in postmodernism, it's how we understand God. So remember, I said truth is relative. So spirituality is also relative. How I decide to view God can be different from how you view God. Maybe I think I reach God through meditation. I'm just going to meditate, and that's how I'm going to find God. Maybe you feel that you need to pray, and that's how you're going to find God. It's okay. Doesn't matter, because how I see it is perfect. How you see it is fine by you. You do, as long as you're not trying to impose your will against mine. Okay? And it can be problematic because it becomes much more personal. And this is where we get that question: why do I need to go to church? Why do I need to go to church? If I can feel connected to God through, my own personal prayer, maybe through doing yoga, I feel at peace and spiritually attuned to God. So I don't need to go to church anymore. Right? These are things that happen to me, unfortunately, because God now fits into their own culture. It's not our own culture should try to be applied, or God is who we are, or our culture, our worldview, our kingdom culture. It should be what we're striving for. Now it has to fit in my mind. Kingdom culture has to fit in what I believe in, has to fit around what I want. And then selfism is how we understand ourselves. So without God, we lose purpose. We said this. And because of this, they start to look at the world for purpose. So they look at the material to find meaning. So unfortunately, we know that material goods are all temporary. But this is where we get that selfism, where I'm now thinking, okay, I need to be successful, successful, I need to make a lot of money, I need to do this. If I do all this, I'll be successful, which will mean what? I am happy. And it's kind of a lot of what selfism is trying to get towards. How can I be happy? Right? So we're kind of guiding towards, and that all comes from that postmodernism. This little chart, again, you'll see it in your slides, and we're going to go through just maybe secularism and detachment. We won't go through that. We'll leave that for next class. The last little bit, we're just going to have a little bit of a case study. Okay, so before we go into secularism, spirituality, and selfism, which will be taught in the next class, we'll do a little bit of case study. And we want to just talk about these three different humans, right? So we have three different boys, all friends in grade 11. Okay, you see that they're different. They have different personalities, right? They're all being affected by the culture. What I want to ask you guys right now, and we'll split you guys up into groups, let's say 2 or 3. It's how can we connect with their cultural norms or with their belief system, like their worldview, to try to have that one-on-one or personal connection. That's all we want to get to today. How can I start to talk about them from their cultural point of view? So one person is an ultra high achiever, super competitive, enjoys social setting, wants to be accepted by others, seeks approval from others. Other one, not worried about being accepted by others, knows the trends, is popular, and will usually go to youth meetings and other events, but does not necessarily focus on what's being said. And then one is more introverted, enjoys playing video games, can socialize well in certain settings, and values suspension. He will go to his meetings if his specific friends are going there. So, as I said, what I want us to focus on, again, what we discussed today is the culture. So, based on these three people, I want us to know what is their culture, how can I try to connect with it. Okay, that's all we're going to take. You guys can do the first group or the first person, the ultra achiever. 1, 2. You 2 can work on the second person, the popular guy, and you 3 will be the introvert guy. Right? These people are actually real people that I have worked with growing up, and again, it's very interesting how their paths of life went based on their cultural. Right? It's 5:49. Maybe you guys 5 minutes to do this. All right, and then we'll discuss the last one. Okay, so we'll start with this.
We have 3 major points.
3 major points.
Here's sort of the points.
And you have to be loud because it's being recorded.
Okay. So basically, he's older than 30. He loves 30. We can use that to our advantage. Right? We're going to give him self-challenge. Let's say we have a group of people, and we say from this week to the next week, we're going to grade every day once. And the next week, we're going to we can class. Where it's like it's a social hierarchy, but it's not really social. You know what I mean? There's a good. That's one thing. Another thing that you can, let's say, exceptionally smart at things even not related to Christianity, maybe mathematics, maybe soccer. So you teach other kids how to do it. This way, you can see the validation that you want, and like teach the others how to do it. So you happy and help each other's attitude with, you know.
Last thing, was talking about is. Like in this age, we can look around and we can have fun, and be a little bit, like, I bet you can't do what you do. He's like, fuel, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna show you that. As soon as he studied King's conference, and he's like, he's happy, he did it, and it's a better age where you can go back and forth. Frankly, like 9 and 10 is not as, they're not as mature. Yeah, you want to add anything?
I would also feel like so many challenges, certain maybe you can have this alter, like the higher tier, you can challenge yourself to achieve it, and also because Google knowledge, you can realize with maturity time that when you Google and acceptance needs something that he is a high schooler, he's but it is important to not grow. That's what challenging him, I think.
So I'm gonna throw a wrench in your comments. By the way, it's all great. I love it. So we put two things up there, also competitive, wants approval from others. How do you see this to be a problem when you're trying to give them challenges or tasks?
Maybe they have this sense of ignorance. Or something. Like you're talking to people about, because we want to be the part of the show.
So I was going to go more towards the approval of others. You don't want to be a teacher's pet. So it almost sometimes can contradict. You want to give them challenges almost, but not so much that they shine so much that it's like, oh, it's this guy again. He's going to be teacher's pet, and then he gets helps all the right?
Yeah, so he kind of humbles us, but challenges us.
Exactly.
It's sort of like if you push yourself, you might be like, yeah, I bet you be wrong, but then he wants that straight. And then you gain confidence in yourself. That's how you can sure.
So when we talk about this person's culture, you can say, and we mentioned that he is that competitive culture. He wants to, achieve, and he wants all these things. That's very good. We'll say grounds for growth. Like you said, I love like I said, the bet you can't or poke one at, because I think that's a nice, simple way of connecting with the person without at the same time making it super formal or, making him be, so outspit that other people are going to be like, oh, this guy is so annoying, right? Because unfortunately with this one, I can tell you now, when he was younger, he was very annoying, right? Because he was very much teacher's pet, right? So it's like, how do you find that happy balance when we're trying to connect with them? Whereas I can get him to, grow closer to God without making him feel that he's not getting the approval of others, right? So almost sometimes maybe it's personal challenges between you and him. It doesn't have to be something very public.
I think you can look at it from one angle, because I can relate to this because that's pretty much what I'm doing.
Yeah.
She would be, she wanted to be someone to that. She wanted to do his friends, but at the same time, she is not going to coach anymore. She's not going to be, because she's shy. She said, like, I'm not going to be accepted by them. And that's how I dad see other, because it's not like she wanted validation from everybody, but because she doesn't feel like she's good enough to be accepted by the group because she's not talking the language, right? So if you go challenge somebody like this, I can think my mother going to come to Sunday school another time.
So that's interesting. So, and again, maybe because I know these people personally, so it's a little different. I understand. So this person isn't necessarily shy. So I think that's a very interesting point that you bring. If someone's shy, this is cool. That also changes this altogether. That changes the whole thing.
We need to. It's not one size fits all.
No, and that's a perfect point. No one thing will fit all people, right? The idea is tailored to each person, right? Each person can be slightly different. Each person is going to have their own ways of being connected, right? So with this person, I know that they were very good at challenges, but they didn't want to show off too much because they felt if they showed off too much, people aren't gonna like them, and people aren't gonna like them, then it ruins their whole speaking of approval or being accepted. Right, so there has to be that middle ground. It's why, like I said, I really enjoyed how you guys kind of said the poking fun at, or how many are doing things in groups where it's like a general challenge to everyone, right? And then like, hey, you did it, good for you, you know, you give them some personal praise. But I like that. All right, just for the sake of time, we'll go to the next group. So second one, the cool guy, popular.
Yeah, so we try to read between the lines for this, so like I'm not worried about exception, know the trends, meaning. So they're often current events, they know all the latest controversies, they know all the stuff you're talking about. Goes to youth meetings and doesn't really focus on what you said. Probably maybe because they think they have all the answers already, they know everything that's going on, so they don't need to pay attention. And so, there's all those people what's going on, so as a servant, you need to know really what's going on. To be able to, one, get them interested in that, because if you are knowledgeable and really well versed in that stuff, that will help them focus more. And yeah, so the point about them being not focusing or things like that. Like I said, so they think they have the answers. So then if they're not focusing, one possibility is to direct these titles. I don't want to, well, I guess, or address them in the class setting. And that way they're put on the spot more or less. And engage them. Like if they're not focusing, then why that might be, because maybe they think they know or whatever. And so hearing what they have to say, like, and bringing it up in the class setting. Other than that, going out with them one-on-one. If they're not focused in the class setting, they'll focus into just the two of you. Yeah.
So I actually really appreciate that. I like two things that you said. The one that they feel like they know everything, they have all the answers. That really does affect the person. When their culture, they have that world culture, they feel they know all the answers. It might affect them. It's like, why do I need to listen to this? Oh, I know it's this is stupid. This doesn't apply to me, or whatever it might be. So it's great that you mentioned that. And something that did work really well with this person, as you mentioned, was the one-on-one times. So it is good to have those one-on-one situations, especially when someone's not focusing. This is where it really helps to have plenty of servants, because I know that all of us are very busy. I know all of us might not always get a chance to see 20 different kids. But you know, when we have more servants like you guys that are able to focus on 2 or 3, 4, 5 kids, you know, that makes such a world of a difference, and it connects them and it helps them bring them closer to God. And in the end, what is the goal of our ministry? It's not about me, it's about God. It's about bringing them closer to God. So if I'm doing that, then I'm doing the right thing. So if you're connecting one-on-one, that's great. And that helps in the end. The only thing that I would say is to be careful with is that they don't get too connected to you and forget, again, the purpose is what God, right? And that's something I think we also as servants fall into. I know personally for me, one of my biggest issues when I was younger was the favoritism. It's, oh, this kid listens to me the most, so therefore I like them. I'll spend the one-on-one times with them and not this person, when that person needed me a lot more. You know, Christ didn't come for the healthy, he came for the sick, right? That's exactly what we need to do in our service as well. It's those people that need us to outreach more. They're the ones we need to be able to focus on. The ones that are probably well adjusted, you know, their parents are probably teaching them like all the liturgical, all the theology at home. It's why they're so well adjusted, right? But we need to make sure we can reach out and do our part, because in the end, it's that, you know, there's the 99 sheep, there's the one sheep that might be lost, right? And we can't give up. We have to be persistent, and I think that's also something very important. The other thing I would mention with this person, because he is the popular one, and he said specifically he doesn't care about being accepted by others. You guys mentioned challenging him or calling him out. Most kids, that actually might be very dangerous, right? That can be very dangerous. For this person specifically, I know for a fact, didn't matter. It's like, you want to challenge me? Bring it on, right? So it worked for that one person, might not necessarily work for everyone, and just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I want to echo this big time, because I think putting a extra many relevance on the spot and basically donor education. It's secondary problem. I would say it's a very problematic in all cases, like even when it doesn't necessarily show on the person, like, you know, it would, it's a failure because it's part of his right. He's gonna, he's not gonna, it's not gonna surface. So you want to be very careful with something like that. I don't want it to be good.
Yeah, I think what we want is not this challenge, but more of bring the focus to them and get their perspective, and so they feel they are appreciated.
Yeah, with the point of the focus.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, and that's good. Last, introvert.
Okay, so I made an introvert and enjoys playing video games. So playing video games with them would be a great way to create an icebreaker with them. Yeah, so like, yeah, like sharing that same office stuff there. Games would be a good idea. Have someone online with them, just connecting over. Even if it's virtual, but good idea. It says here that people can socialize well in certain settings and values friendships. So good idea to connect with friends. But like was mentioned that it could be selective, so you only want to socialize with certain people with certain locations or certain periods. So if you connect with his friends, you're going to gain the trust that maybe that put that this trust development. And when there's selectives, choose the setting that we want to be connecting with them to like one-on-one thing. I think this would be a way to end the relationship with that trust. And understand the setting that we're going to go and get straight on. Like basically the events. Last one I made another thing to be with these people friends. So just to when people are some socialize with this people friends, if you have get another more comfortable knowledge.
Absolutely. So I appreciate that you focus kind of on the settings. So with that person specifically, I know that again, he flourished in very specific settings. So you as a servant want to learn what settings are they more outgoing in, what more settings, what settings do they perform well in? So I can kind of get that to build that connection, build that trust. I know with this guy, none of the servants played games, so it was kind of unfortunate. They couldn't really connect on that. But sometimes there is a video game culture. You all know that. So there is other ways to connect without necessarily playing the video games, right? And that becomes very important. I know even in my service, I used to do these events with some of the youth that I had where we do the sleepovers. We get games. I suck at all of them. But you know, someone would bring their like Nintendo Switch or whatever. We'd all have fun. We'd have a sleepover. Life was good, right? Then we got to connect. So the one that was really quiet, such as this person, right? They were with them, and they really enjoyed these settings because it's like I'm one of the people, you know. And this is my environment where I get to show off my skills. You know, now I get to show you how good I am with the games and whatnot. So it's very important with this last person is to understand their culture. We want to make sure we connect with them on their settings, on their environments, because environments play a big role in what we do. And with that being said, thank you guys for paying attention. I only went over by 10 minutes. I do want to mention that we're no. But thank you guys. If you have any comments or feedback, please let me know, and we'll see you guys next week on. Thank you.